This video will require a working knowledge of in-game graphical settings and terminologies, such as anti-aliasing, screen resolution, VSync, etc. Hey Rockstars, Vane here, and welcome to Tweaking 101, the series where I show you how to tweak games for better performance. In this episode I'm going to be covering the Unreal Engine. Now, not only is the Unreal Engine one of the most commonly used engines out there today, but it's also one of the easiest to tweak in my opinion. Alright, quick hypothetical. Let's say that you've identified a game that runs on the Unreal Engine, and you'd like to tweak that game to make it run a little bit smoother. Where do you find the file to tweak? Well, that can be easy or difficult. Normally, I'd recommend searching online to find the location or path of the tweakable file, but commonly they can be found in your Documents folder. Other times, they're found in the actual game installation folder, which is on your C drive commonly, and program files times 86 if you're on a 64-bit system, but we'll get into that another time. Let's say, for the time being, that you have identified the file that needs to be tweaked. Commonly, it'll say engine.ini, something along those lines. So first we're going to start with Borderlands 2, which is, of course, one of my most popular tweak fixes. So we'll go ahead and we'll open this up. Now, commonly with the Unreal Engine, you're going to see an engine ini file. In this case, it's willowengine.ini. So, I've already got it open down here. Let's give you guys a good look at this. And this is what you're going to be greeted by pretty much 9 times out of 10 with the Unreal Engine. You've got the protocol right here, Unreal. Now, this is pretty much exactly what you're going to see every time you're greeted by an Unreal Engine. And just to put that into perspective, Batman Arkham City also runs on the Unreal Engine. Let's take a look at that ini file. Pretty damn identical, right? Yeah. Alright, so let's get into it. Before we get into this, here's a brief overview of tweaking and what we hope to accomplish by tweaking this file. By tweaking this file, we can accomplish many different things. Primarily what we want to do is disable certain aspects of the game engine that are responsible for graphical effects that can be taxing on your hardware. By disabling these, we can improve our frame rate, thus making the gameplay much more smooth. These are options that are not necessarily available in the in-game settings. Another thing to note is that we can actually have the adverse effect by tweaking a game engine file. We can in fact enhance the visuals past the in-game visual settings. But in most cases, you are going to need a powerful PC to do such a thing. Alright, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, we need to get comfortable with a tool called the Find tool. So to bring it up, hit Ctrl plus F. Now you should be greeted by this little window right here. Now we're going to use this to find certain variables inside the engine. It's actually a lot easier than just tediously scrolling through the entire ini file. That's way too time consuming and we're not going to be doing that. So first we want to locate max proc. That's MAXPROC. Make sure it's set to down. Now we're going to find next. This is what you should see right here. These are the first variables that we're going to be tweaking. This is the texture resolution size of pretty much every texture in the game. So, the higher the number, the sharper the textures. Now, textures, in my experience, have little to no bearing on frame rate. If you feel they do, then please feel free to lower this number. The lowest it can possibly go, and be sure to note this, is 64. Now, we're talking god ugly. Just god-awful ugly. Now, 64 is just muddy, and everything will just look like claymation. I don't in good conscience recommend you use a texture size of 64. But if you feel like screwing around just for fun, shits and giggles, go right ahead. I won't stop you. But this number has to be a multiple of 64. So we can go 128, we can go 512, we can go 1024, we can go 2048, and then finally, for crystal clear, sharp as hell textures, we want to go 4096, which is actually the texture resolution size featured in my Borderlands 2 tweak fix. So, if that's anything to go by, it will not impact your performance. I can almost guarantee that. But again, if it does, feel free to revert to the default, which is 1024, and the bottom one was 512. Those are the default settings of those two variables. But for now, we're going to switch them back, because we like them sharp textures. Right. Bring up your Find tool again. The next thing we're going to be looking for is MIP. Now, it should bring up the next 4 lines. These are what we're going to focus on. MIP fade in speed, MIP fade out speed, and then again, repeat it. So, normally by default, these are 1 point something. So, we want to zero that out. So, basically delete everything after the equal sign. After that, we're going to replace it with a 0. So, once you have all 4 variables zeroed out, that's great. Now, what we do this for is because... Actually, have you ever played Borderlands 2 and noticed some nasty texture pop in? You'll be looking at an object and you'll notice that the textures just pop in after a few seconds. Or if you turn around really quickly and all the textures just randomly load in. This will cause them to load instantly. You will not notice a texture pop in. Another interesting fact, believe it or not, in Borderlands 2, is that the texture pop-in actually reduces the frame rate. So not only is it ugly as hell, but it actually impacts the frame rate as well. So zero these variables out and good riddance texture pop-in. And also, this affects a lot of other games running on the Unreal Engine. Next, we want to bring up our Find tool again, and this time we're going to type in smooth. Now, you should be brought to this variable right here. Now, what this does is, you'll notice actually the 2 lines below it as well. Minimum smooth frame rate. So you can probably already tell what this function does. Its intention is to smooth out the frame rate by adding frame rate caps, basically locking the frame rate at a certain rate. So by typing, well actually first we're going to remove true, and we're going to replace it with false. Now what that will do is remove the frame rate cap. Your frame rate will be completely variable. Okay, when ready, go ahead and type in System Settings in your Find tool, and then click Find Next. Alright, this section is the big one. This is what will significantly increase your frame rate. But before you go absolutely batshit insane and switch everything to false in this section, be warned that one wrong variable here can actually break your game. And that is why we're actually going to practice the tried and true method of trial and error. In case we do something and change a variable that potentially breaks our game, we can always come back and change it. So what we're going to do is we're going to find one variable that we want to change, and then we're going to switch it to false, we're going to save, we're going to exit, and then we're going to launch the game to make sure the tweak applied successfully. Now, that sounds time consuming and tedious, right? That's because it is. Now, this is not easy. This is actually pretty tedious and hard work to determine what tweaks work and what tweaks don't. So, as we look through this section, we see a lot of familiar things, don't we? We see depth of field, ambient occlusion, bloom, light shafts, distortion, and a bunch of other very familiar things that you would commonly see in-game in the video settings. So, we're going to cover several different variables which impact your frame rate significantly. So first we're going to start off with dynamic lights. Now, this has been known to cause issues in the Unreal Engine when disabled. For example, in Borderlands 2, and believe me, I get this a lot on Borderlands 2 Tweak Fix. When people start out in the game with my tweaks, they'll notice in the glacier area, it's very, very bright. Yes, I get it. Now, here's the thing. That is caused by this line right here. Dynamic lights. Dynamic lights are disabled in my tweak. Now, that will cause basically the brightness of the glacier area to make your eyes bleed. So, anyway, once you're out of the glacier area, it's okay. It diffuses and it returns to normal. But it's only for that initial area that you're going to notice it's very, very bright. So, I hope that answers that question once and for all, for the hundreds of people that have already asked it. So, there's nothing that can really be done about it. Also, dynamic lights has an interesting impact on Batman Arkham City, whereas when it's disabled, it causes a lot of the doors in-game to become blacked out. So, this is a graphical artifact caused by this line. So, basically, disable this one at your own risk. Now, dynamic shadows. Of course, that can always pretty much be disabled safely. So, switch that to false. Dynamic shadows, if you don't already know, are moving shadows. There are static shadows which remain still. Those have virtually no impact on your frame rate. Now, dynamic shadows, on the other hand, are extraordinarily taxing to your frame rate. You want to disable these at all costs if you are on a low-end system. There is just no question it will increase your frame rate substantially. So you want to definitely put false beside dynamic shadows when at all possible. Next, we'll skim through this. Motion blur, of course we want to disable that. So that is a big no-no on low-end systems, so go ahead and put false beside that. Now, depth of field, that's another one. Go ahead and put false. Depth of field, for anybody that doesn't know, it is when you are focusing on one object. If you ever notice, in fact, in real life, put your hand up very close to your face. Now, you'll notice that your hand is very clear when you're just looking and focusing at your hand. In your peripheral vision, everything else is blurry. This is actually the act of depth of field, and this is what it does. When you're focusing on a specific object in-game, and your eyes are trained on that object, you'll notice that everything in the background becomes blurry. Now, that is actually very taxing on your hardware as well. You want to disable that. And then there's ambient occlusion, which is another really good thing to disable because that's incredibly taxing on your hardware. Ambient occlusion is the way that light reflects off of objects. Ambient occlusion gives it a more defined realism, so definitely go ahead and disable that. And now, high-end system or not, I always recommend disabling bloom when possible, because bloom is just a really ugly effect to me. Personally, anyway, because bloom is... it just makes the glow of light intense. For example, staring at the sun, it pretty much blots out everything else. Also, I don't recommend staring at the sun. Please don't do that. That just will end very badly. So, disable that when possible. It will actually increase your frame rate by disabling it. That's also fair to note. Light shafts, that's another thing, also referred to as God rays, I believe. Now, this is when light streams in through objects, you'll see rays of light. Now, that is definitely taxing on your hardware, and you want to disable that when possible. Distortion. Yes, we definitely want to disable this as well on low-end systems. But I've actually seen this option work well on other low-end systems, and then work disastrously on other systems, which I don't really fully understand. Maybe some chipsets are optimized to handle it better, but I just recommend going ahead and disabling it because your frame rate will thank you. Distortion is, for example, if you've ever looked through a stream of water and it distorts what's beneath it. That is the act of distortion. Or if you've ever been out on a really hot day and noticed a heat haze and everything looks wavy, that is also distortion. Games try to mimic this effect, and it is very taxing on your hardware, so definitely disable it when possible. Lens flares, well, just go ahead and watch any J.J. Abrams movie and you get the gist. But anyway, go ahead and switch that to false. Fog volumes, that's another one you want to switch to false, because fog volumes deals with particle effects in game, and particles, especially dynamic particles, those can be extraordinarily taxing on your hardware. Go ahead and switch that to false. Now, we're going to look at DirectX 11. Allow DirectX 11 rather. And not all integrated chipsets will allow DirectX 11. And by the way, that is what DirectX 11 stands for, is DirectX 11. So when possible, go ahead and disable that, because not only do chipsets, well rather certain chipsets, not support DirectX 11, but it also impacts your frame rate heavily as well. Now, radial blur. Now, radial blur is basically if you're going extremely fast. Let's say you're running at 200 miles an hour. I don't know why or how the hell you would do that, but let's just say hypothetically you are. Now, you'll notice that you start to get something called tunnel vision. Now, when you're going so fast that everything to the sides of you are but a blur, this is radial blur. And games try to mimic basically the act of going really, really fast, and they add radial blur basically to make it seem far more realistic. So, false, of course. After that, let's take a look through. Okay, max anisotropy. Now, anisotropic filtering is basically how clear textures look at distance. Now, I've never had much of a problem with anisotropic filtering and frame rates. In very certain games I have, but in most commonly, anisotropic filtering doesn't have much of an impact on frame rate. So I commonly keep that around 16 samples. But if you feel that this impacts your frame rate, then go ahead and switch it to 2. I'm not 100% certain, but I feel that you can switch it to 1 or 0 safely. But me personally, I keep it at 16. In fact, sometimes I bump it up to 32. But that is experimental at best. I don't recommend you switch anisotropic filtering to 32. A lot of games will not actually even support that. Borderlands 2, though, I think it does, but I'm not 100% certain. So I just keep it at 16 to be on the safe side, of course. Now, FXAA. FXAA is post-processing anti-aliasing, or a form of post-processing anti-aliasing. So, of course, we want to, as usual, switch it to false, because if you're watching this video, you should know how much of an impact anti-aliasing has on your frame rate. It's only common sense. And anti-aliasing, actually, to explain it a little better, is the act of smoothing out edges to reduce those jagged lines that look like a staircase, otherwise known as jaggies. Now, anti-aliasing works to smooth out those jagged lines. FXAA in particularly, it more or less imposes an overlay on your screen. And not only does FXAA smooth out jaggies, but at the same time, it seems to blur the entire screen, and the colors just kind of seem washed out. So, if at all possible, completely disable this and never use it. Even if you got a high-end system, there are much better forms of anti-aliasing out there. But FXAA, I can't even recommend in the slightest. Now, the next one we're going to focus on is resolution. Now, a lot of games nowadays, I'm noticing fewer and fewer are supporting a resolution of 640 by 480. Now, if you need to, and you can't go below, say, like, for example, Dead Space 3, in-game, you cannot go below 1024 by 768. However, of course, in my Dead Space 3 Tweak Fix episode, I did find a way to bypass that, but now, here, you can actually change the resolution to whatever the heck your heart desires. Say, for example, you have a custom frame rate in mind, but your game does not have the option for it. You know what, I'm just going to wing it here. So let's say 555 by 555. Sure, go ahead. But actually, I'm not entirely sure if that will work or not, but let's say, hypothetically, you can't go below 800 by 600, and you really want 640 by 480, because, of course, it's going to increase your frame rate immensely. So, just type in to the Res X-axis, 640. Now, Res X and Res Y refers to, basically, horizontal and vertical resolutions. So, Res X is your horizontal resolution, excuse me. So from left to right, that is the resolution. So 640 pixels rather. So now resolution Y refers to your Y-axis, which is vertically, so up and down. So we want to put this at 480. Now that is 480. Keep stumbling on my words, I apologize. So that is 480 pixels high. So basically that will give you the best possible frame rate. But if you feel even cheaper and you want to go lower than that, I know a few handy ones off the top of my head. Oh yeah, there's a good one, 500 by 350. Now, this resolution actually isn't that bad. In fact, it actually kind of, sort of, to me anyway, looks a little better than 640 by 480. I think that's because this resolution is a 16 by 9 widescreen resolution. So the picture quality isn't degraded as bad as it would be in a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. But if you feel even cheaper than that, and I don't know why you would, you can go as low as 300 by 200 safely, but oh my god, I don't recommend using this resolution. I implore you not to. It is so ugly, your eyes will surely vomit. But let's go ahead and switch that back to 640 by 480, and my fingers are stupidly big. Alright, there we go. Now that that's switched back, well, I guess we've covered the basics. The rest you guys are going to have to figure out on your own. The best way to learn really is through hands-on practice. So keep at it, and you'll eventually master it in no time. After you're done tweaking the file, go ahead and close it, and save the changes, of course. Now, we're going to go ahead and right-click on the file that you just tweaked. We're going to click Properties. Now make sure the read-only checkbox is checked. By default, it's not. So go ahead and give it a check, and then Apply. What this will do is prevent the game from making changes to our tweaked file. We don't want the game to undo our tweaks, right? So go ahead and check that, and it will ensure that the game does not undo our progress. So that's pretty much it, guys. Just remember the methods of trial and error, and another good tip is, if you ever encounter any problems where you need to wipe the file out and you need the default file back, go ahead and delete the INI entirely, and then go ahead and launch the game. The game will actually create a brand new default INI by itself. So, no harm, no foul. In case you screw up, just follow that method, and then start tweaking all over again. As always, guys, you rock. Take care.